For me, the appeal of Star Trek lies mostly in its blending of pulp sci-fi and progressive political and social commentary. But one of the great things about Star Trek, and one of the reasons it has endured for so many years in so many forms, is that it appeals to different segments of the audience for various reasons. Lots of fans look to Star Trek for escapism. They enjoy imagining themselves living in the fictional world of the story, which I get. It's not the main draw for me, but it's certainly understandable. Who wouldn't want to live in the utopian future depicted in Star Trek? But that raises another question. Star Trek has been around since the 1960s. Hundreds of hours of television and movies have been produced, and those movies and TV shows don't all take place in the same time frame. That being the case, whenever someone says they wish they lived in the world of Star Trek, the next thing I want to ask them is, which Star Trek era would you actually want to live in? For the purposes of this video, I'm going to mostly limit my considerations to eras that we see depicted on screen in a Trek show or film. Star Trek takes place across a total time span of over 1,000 years. But we only really see intervals of a few decades across a few centuries. Even eras that are the settings of multiple films or multiple series require a lot of inference and supposition in order to form an impression of what it might be like to live there, since Star Trek is a sci-fi adventure series and not a documentary about life in the future, despite the fact that some fans have somehow gotten that impression. And therefore, the picture we get of the time period in which each show or movie is set is only as complete as the story demands. The earliest fictional era that we see a little bit of, and here described a little bit more, is the early to mid 21st century. I'm going to go ahead and disqualify this era from consideration for two reasons. First, judging by what we see of this era from the film Star Trek First Contact and learn of it secondhand through dialogue in several other Star Trek shows, including Star Trek the Original Series, Star Trek The Next Generation, and Star Trek Deep Space Nine, it seems to be defined by economic and environmental disaster and multiple global conflicts culminating in a devastating nuclear exchange that destroys much of human civilization and results in tens of millions of deaths. So it doesn't seem like a very nice time to live. And second, depending on your age when you're watching this, most of you are going to get to live through it. Or part of it, at least. And judging by the way things are going, it's not going to be all that different from Star Trek. Nobody's going to invent warp drive, and no Vulcans are coming to rescue us at the end. But other than that, I'd say we're on track. Way to go, everybody! But for this exercise, let's stick to optimistic fantasy rather than inescapable nightmarish reality. The closest future era that none of us will actually live to see that is depicted in a Star Trek show is the mid-22nd century. This is the setting of Enterprise, the 6th Star Trek television series produced, but the earliest in terms of time period. The first season of Enterprise takes place in the year 2151. By that point, so far as we can tell from the show, things on Earth seem pretty good. There's a global government, world peace. The utopian Star Trek future has more or less taken shape. Details on how the economy actually works at this point are scarce, but we're told that poverty, hunger, and disease are no longer serious concerns. Plus, this is the era when humanity launches its first starships capable of long-range interstellar exploration. Alliances with other worlds are formed, the foundation for what will eventually become the United Federation of Planets is laid. This era has a lot going for it. There are some drawbacks. In 2153, some aliens show up with a giant death ray and zap a 4,000-kilometer path from Florida to Venezuela, killing 7 million people. I'm sure that wasn't fun, especially if you lived along that path of destruction. But you know what? Florida is best avoided in any era of imaginary future history, if you ask me. Earth and the Klingons make first contact with each other, and they really get off on the wrong foot. Right away, it's clear these two groups are just not going to get along. Also, at some point during this era, there is a multi-year war between Earth and the Romulans. We've never actually seen it on screen, much to the consternation of certain members of the fan base, but It's an interplanetary war, so I'm assuming it's no Sunday school orgy. After the mid-22nd century, we skip ahead about another 100 years or so and come to one of the major settings of the franchise, the mid-23rd century. So far, 4 Star Trek series have taken place during this era. Star Trek the original series and its follow-up, Star Trek the animated series, during the 2260s, and the first 2 seasons of Star Trek Discovery and its spin-off, Star Trek Strange New Worlds, a few years before that in the 2250s. We see very little of Earth during this era, but from what we hear, things are going pretty well. Still peaceful, still unified. Prejudice and intolerance and violence still relics of the past, so much so that whenever some judgy alien shows up and starts giving humans a hard time about being savage and primitive, Captain Kirk just throws it right back, like, nuh-uh, not anymore. It's an era of expansion, humans playing a leading role in the Federation, building impressive space stations like Starbase One, spreading out into the galaxy to establish colonies. It's an age of optimism, prosperity, and thrilling exploration and discovery. Unless you're serving aboard a Starfleet ship and facing torture and death on a regular, let's say, weekly basis, it seems like an exciting and relatively safe time to live. But don't make your time travel plans quite yet. There's a war between the Federation and the Klingons that doesn't last super long, but gets pretty nasty before it's over. There's an incident where Control, the AI Starfleet's been using for threat assessment, becomes self-aware and tries to wipe out all sentient life in the galaxy, which all works out okay, ultimately, but still, bit of a nail-biter. There's another war between the Federation and the Klingons that only lasts like a day before some godlike aliens step in and force everyone to knock it off. And after a century of isolationism following their war with Earth, the Romulans start fucking shit up again. If the mid-23rd century sounds attractive but a little too eventful for you, might I recommend a couple of options. First, we have an alternative mid-23rd century over in the Kelvin timeline, as seen in the 2009 Star Trek film and its sequels, Star Trek Into Darkness and Star Trek Beyond. Aside from the occasional act of terrorism, the odd starship crashing into a city, and the complete destruction of planet Vulcan along with most of its billions of inhabitants, it seems all right. Earth looks nice. Or, if you'd rather stay in the prime timeline, how about skipping a few years ahead to the late 23rd century, the 2280s and 90s, as shown in the films centered on the original Star Trek cast, beginning with Star Trek the Motion Picture and continuing through Star Trek VI. It's a crisis-filled era, but each crisis is resolved relatively quickly with little to no lasting damage. V'ger, a gigantic cloud-shrouded spaceship that travels to Earth and threatens to exterminate humanity, zapping a couple of Klingon ships and a space station out of existence along the way, just kinda leaves after finally getting laid. Khan, a genetically engineered supervillain, briefly gets his hands on a potential weapon of mass destruction, but he just ends up blowing himself up and creating a new planet, which subsequently blows itself up. So nothing for the average citizen to worry about there. A gigantic probe that speaks in whale song randomly shows up to Earth and wrecks shop for a few hours, but then it leaves and things go back to normal. And a Klingon moon explodes. The Klingons are all like, hey, let's be friends, to the Federation, but then their chancellor gets assassinated and it looks like we might be going to war again. But then that all gets resolved peacefully, and the most noticeable consequence that comes out of it is us humans having to get over the reflexive hatred of Klingons we've clung to as a species for over a century at this point, which is presumably no problem for people native to this era, what with how enlightened and evolved they are, but might present an issue for some of us planning to relocate to this era, because we sure do love our entrenched prejudices. When you ponder which time period of Star Trek history in which you'd like to live, do you prefer an epoch of mystery and possibility? If so, have I got an era for you, the Lost Era. This is the period that stretches from the end of Star Trek VI to the beginning of Star Trek The Next Generation, which is around 70 years. It seems fine, I guess. That's the thing, because no Star Trek project has ever used it as a primary setting, and it's only occasionally even been referred to, we don't know much about it at all. It might be a time of peace and scientific and social progress unequaled in all of history, or it might be a time of war and disaster where death lurks around every corner and the common people of the galaxy live their lives in a constant state of existential fear. Or, somewhere in the middle. Here's the most important thing to keep in mind before you jump in your reality-hopping time machine and set course for the late 23rd to early to mid-24th century of the fictional Star Trek future. If they keep making new Star Trek, and especially if the current trend of backward-looking, nostalgia-obsessed franchise production continues for a while, it's only a matter of time before the creators of that new Star Trek decide to start setting stuff in the Lost Era, and who the hell knows what they're gonna come up with. The Gorn might conquer the Tellarites and open an interstellar chain of pork barbecue restaurants. The Orion Syndicate might blow up Venus. Do you ever hear people talking about Venus on TNG or Deep Space Nine? That explains it. Reportedly, the upcoming Star Trek Section 31 movie, which is scheduled to be released on Paramount Plus 2 days after this video is released on YouTube, is set sometime during the Lost Era. But I ain't seen it yet, so I have no idea if it's going to make the Lost Era look like a hell of a time to be alive or a living hell. After the Lost Era comes the era that is the exact opposite of Lost, by far the most extensively and consistently represented time period of Star Trek history, the mid-24th century, beginning in the 2360s, which is the primary setting of Star Trek The Next Generation, and the 2 series that followed it, Deep Space Nine and Voyager, plus the 4 TNG-centered films. I bet for a lot of you, this is the era you'd pick, isn't it? When Trekkies, especially around my age, daydream about the utopian future of Star Trek, replicators, ubiquitous site-to-site teleportation, and all the wonders of fully automated luxury space communism, they're thinking of the world depicted in the shows set during this era. And usually they're specifically thinking of TNG. Which is only natural. TNG is Star Trek at its most reassuring and optimistic. Earth, the most important world in the United Federation of Planets, continues to be peaceful and unified. The moneyless economy is in full operation. Work is no longer a necessity for survival, but something people choose as a way of improving themselves and their society. Humanity continues to spread out across the galaxy, colonizing new worlds. Starfleet, with humanity seemingly accounting for most of its personnel, continues to carry out its diplomatic and scientific missions. Food comes out of voice-operated magic holes in the wall. We do hear tell of a couple of wars and other lesser-armed conflicts between the Federation and, say, the Cardassians, the Talarians, the Zenkethi. That one's brought up once or twice in episodes of Deep Space Nine, but same era. But those all take place off-screen and are already over by the time we hear them mentioned. And come on, wars happening in other places that we don't have to see or think very much about, we love those. In other words, life is pretty goddamn good in the 24th century. For humans, anyway. I'm guessing the audience for this video is mostly humans. So why wouldn't you want to live in this era of Star Trek? There are actually lots of reasons why you shouldn't want to live in this era of Star Trek. Remember, you'd be living there, not watching it on TV. You wouldn't be the main character. You'd be you, an anonymous nobody at the mercy of events occurring at scales so large you can barely hope to comprehend them, let alone affect them. Some of those events might be pretty scary. For example, the attempted invasion of the Borg. One big-ass cube from an alien species most people in the Federation had probably only just heard of, destroying an entire fleet of ships, almost succeeding at conquering Earth. That might get you wishing you'd settled in a different temporal neighborhood, huh? Let's not forget the Klingon Civil War. It doesn't last long, and the Federation's involvement in it is minimal, but it still seems like it would shake up the whole peaceful utopia vibe this era's got going on otherwise. Plus, there's the second attempted Borg invasion that happens like 5 years after the first one. And then, once you've lived through the TNG years and entered the period where all major events suddenly revolve around some space station halfway across the galaxy called Deep Space Nine, shit really starts to go sideways. First, Starfleet and other Federation institutions are infiltrated by evil shapeshifters from the far end of the galaxy. At one point, this results in the end of peaceful relations between the Federation and the Klingons. At another, it leads to a global power outage on Earth and Starfleet briefly taking direct control of the planet from the civilian government, though technically that wasn't shapeshifters, just an evil admiral using the threat of shapeshifters as a pretense to seize power. But what difference would that make to you, an ordinary citizen just trying to get to your shift at the job you voluntarily chose to improve your own life and the lives of all people on Earth, bridge painting robot repair technician? I sketched out your backstory a little bit, I hope you don't mind. Second, and related to the evil shapeshifter infiltration thing, the biggest war ever happens. The Federation's old enemy, well, newer old enemy, the Cardassians, joined the Dominion. That's the Empire ruled by those evil shapeshifters, in case you're somehow watching this video while not already knowing that. And before you can say inter arma enim silent legis, way before you can say that, it always takes me a couple of tries, and I had 2 years of Latin in high school, outer space has become one great big battlefield. The war never directly reaches Earth or even seems to come very close to it. All the major battles we hear about or see depicted on Deep Space Nine take place in or near Bajoran and Cardassian territory. But at one point, the Dominion captures Beta Z, a Federation world, and positions itself for possible strikes against major Federation planets like Vulcan and Tellar, original home of that amazing pork barbecue chain during the Lost Era, possibly, and Alpha Centauri, which is a little close to home. It's 4 light years from Earth, which is a long way for us, but in Star Trek terms, that's right next door. As an American, the Dominion invading Alpha Centauri would be like having the Nazis invade Canada. Can you imagine that? Why would the Nazis even bother invading Canada? What a waste of time when there are so many of them here already. They control all 3 branches of our federal government. What more do they want? Leave Canada alone, you fucking Nazis! Anyway, the Dominion never actually invades Alpha Centauri or poses a serious direct military threat to Earth, but there is a point where the tide of the war turns against Starfleet, and it looks like the Federation might lose the war. I can't imagine that would be very good for Earth. And sure, like most of the other crises I've talked about in this video, everything works out okay. The Federation does win the war in the end, but not before millions of people have died in the effort. That might not be something you'd want to live through if you had all of imaginary history to choose from. Things settle down a bit as we move from the mid-24th century of the TNG DS9 Voyager era into the late 24th century and early 25th century era, seen in Star Trek Picard, Star Trek Prodigy, and Star Trek Lower Decks. There's nothing to match the prolonged upheaval and widespread devastation of the Dominion War, but there are a bunch more of those pesky short-term crises that threaten to destroy all of existence until they are eventually resolved. Thanks to meddling by Romulan secret agents, androids working on Mars go rogue and wage a planet-wide attack that sets the Martian atmosphere on fire, kills almost 100,000 people, and destroys the main Starfleet shipyard. As a result of that, the Federation bans synthetic life forms, and Starfleet radically scales back its operations, including a planned operation to help evacuate the population of Romulus, whose sun is about to go supernova. Oh, and then the Romulan sun does go supernova, killing, I'm guessing, billions of people, and turning the surviving Romulans into refugees. Then, like 10 years after all that, A bunch of surviving synthetic life forms living on their own planet decide that organic life is too much of a threat to their existence, so they call in an alliance of more highly evolved synthetic organisms to exterminate all organic life in the galaxy. But then they change their mind at the last minute, and that doesn't happen, which is for the best for everyone involved, I think. Let's see what else. Oh! A fleet of starships controlled by an evil AI goes rogue and has to be destroyed, and then a couple of years later, a weapon secretly implanted in a Starfleet ship by an evil time-traveling mine owner and child slaver transmits a computer virus that causes infected ships to go rogue until they are destroyed. And then 15 years later, the Borg take control of a bunch of ships, causing them to go rogue and attack Earth until the Borg cube sending the activation signal or whatever is destroyed. So there was a lot of that sort of thing going on. And there was another evil shapeshifter infiltration thing happening as part of that last compromised ships go rogue deal as well. You know what? Just skip the late 24th and early 25th century. You can do better. After that, there's another even longer Lost Era, though we don't call it the Lost Era, since the Lost Era is already called the Lost Era. We don't really call it anything, and we don't know much of anything about it either. At some point, Starfleet, along with other galactic powers, gets super into time travel, leading to temporal wars in the 29th century that we hear mentioned and catch occasional glimpses of in Star Trek Voyager and Star Trek Enterprise. How much would these conflicts affect the lives of simple bridge weatherproofing drone programmers such as yourself? I cannot say. By the 29th century, bridge painting robots are obsolete, and therefore there's not much demand for repair technicians, hence the career change. I assumed you'd want to remain in the field. Past the 29th century, we don't know much until the late 32nd century, which is the primary setting for the last 3 seasons of Star Trek Discovery. Though originating in the 23rd century, the crew of the show's hero ship, the USS Discovery, jumps over 900 years into the future as part of the plan to prevent Control from wiping out all sentient life in the galaxy. If you forgot, that was like 5 or 6 evil rogue AIs back. This era will also be the primary setting for the upcoming Starfleet Academy series, but for now, all we've seen of the late 32nd century comes from Discovery, and going by that, conditions seem to vary wildly depending on where you are. Now, it sounds like an obvious thing to say, but during the mid-24th century era of TNG, DS9, and Voyager, life in the Federation seemed homogeneously comfortable and pleasant. Unless it was a time of war or crisis, or you were in an especially rugged, inhospitable location, if you lived on a Federation planet or outpost, you were probably doing okay. Sure, Earth in particular is depicted as a paradise, and a few other planets we see appear to be nicer than average, but the average seems pretty high, and that high quality of life seems to be evenly distributed. In the 32nd century, on the other hand, it really makes a difference where you are. Earth still seems pretty nice. Federation/Starfleet headquarters, which is now located in a cool, camouflaged space station, looks secure and comfortable, but the Federation itself has contracted dramatically since the glory days of the 23rd and 24th centuries, as has its military and political power and its benevolent influence. This steep decline in the fortunes of the Federation, along with the rest of the galaxy, is the result of a massive galactic-scale natural disaster called the Burn, which took place about 100 years prior to Discovery's arrival in this era. The Burn affected dilithium, a substance necessary for the operation of starship warp engines, causing all starships with active warp drives at the time of the Burn to explode. The Burn seriously limited the ability to travel faster than light, turning viable dilithium into a scarce and highly sought-after commodity, and compelled many worlds that had been core members of the Federation, including Earth, to withdraw from the galactic community and focus on protecting themselves and their resources. Thanks to the efforts of the Discovery crew, the Federation and other interstellar powers are finally able to begin recovering from the burn and resume long-distance space travel, and the Federation starts to grow its membership once again. But no sooner does that start to happen than the galaxy is threatened by another large-scale catastrophe known as the Dark Matter Anomaly, or DMA, which pulverizes multiple planets and directly threatens Earth before it is stopped after the crew of Discovery locates the highly advanced alien species responsible for creating it and asks them nicely to knock it off. So another terrifying but short-lived threat to life as we know it. Kind of makes you nostalgic for the 23rd and 24th centuries when this kind of thing was happening all the time, huh? I mean, unless you had to live through it, which is the perspective of this video, so forget I said that. Like I said, life on Earth in the 32nd century still seems pretty nice. The planet is isolated and wary of outsiders when the Discovery crew first arrives, but that's quickly phased out as warp travel resumes and the Federation begins rebuilding itself. And again, yeah, the burn and its aftermath and the threat of the DMA would be extremely stressful events, I imagine, but its depiction in Discovery gives the impression of life on Earth being, generally speaking, pretty good. It's hard to tell what impact these events of large-scale galactic importance would have on the lives of ordinary people like you, a humble bridge-painting robot repair technician. They switched back to the robots after the AI controlling the drones caused them to go rogue. Those are all the Star Trek eras you have to choose from, or at least all the ones I'm going to spend time on in this video. And the question remains, which one would you want to live in if that were possible? Your answer to that question might reveal which version of Star Trek is your favorite, but it also might reveal something about you. Because while I've been describing these various eras with the assumption that you would choose to live in the one you found the most comfortable, or inviting, or secure, you could base your choice on something else. Maybe you would want to live in an era where there was a lot of turmoil because you think maybe you'd be able to help. The 1960s was a tumultuous era filled with violence and social upheaval, but it was also an era of incredible social and scientific advancement, major and long overdue progress in black civil rights and women's rights. And we landed on the moon. A bunch. We haven't done that since. The future doesn't just magically get better all by itself, and any improvements, social, political, economic, technological, or otherwise, are still going to require constant maintenance. There will always be room for future improvement, new problems that need addressing, or old problems many people just weren't aware of due to their privileges or biases or flawed perception. And no matter how much progress gets made, there will always be setbacks. I know a lot of fans who feel drawn to Star Trek by its optimistic depiction of the future don't like to see the world of the show become too bleak or even too complicated. They see Star Trek as aspirational and are discouraged or maybe just not very interested when a Star Trek show reveals that the Federation's too-good-to-be-true utopia is actually too good to be true. And that's fair. Art is subjective. It's all a matter of taste. Folks in the audience can like or not like the show for whatever reason, but I do think that viewers who reject versions of Star Trek that aren't sufficiently shiny and happy in their depiction of the future are missing out on an important part of what Star Trek has to say. Taken as a whole, with its many different shows and films produced over the course of many decades, by many different people, with many different points of view, and depicting many different variations of that better future, Star Trek tells us that progress isn't linear, and it isn't permanent. Things don't keep getting better forever. Things are better, things are worse, things start getting better again, and hopefully over the long term, the trend is positive. I don't think this is an intentional part of Star Trek's message to us, but I also don't think it's too much of a stretch to read it that way. Star Trek is aspirational. Star Trek is a fantasy that shows us how much better our world could be, how far we could go if we actually set ourselves to making it that way, put our trifling prejudices and factionalism aside, shook off our short-sightedness, and grew up as a species. But Star Trek isn't meant to just make us feel better about our potential and about the future, though it can definitely do that. It's meant to tell us about ourselves, the good and the bad, so that hopefully we can work toward building a real future that is better for ourselves and future generations. If you are the kind of person who bases your choice of which Star Trek era in which to live on wanting to live in a time where you might be able to help make things better, good news. You're living in such an era right now. We all are. We don't have starships or replicators, which sucks, but we also don't have evil shapeshifters, and the rogue AI that will inevitably try to murder us is still probably a few years off. We do have just entirely too many Nazis in charge of shit. We're in the midst of a setback right now, which is frustrating and scary. Progress toward that better future will be difficult for a while, but just as things don't keep getting better forever, they don't keep getting worse forever either. What makes the difference? What causes history to get back on track toward progress? We do. It doesn't matter which era of Star Trek you'd wish to live in. If we're ever going to get there for real, we need to set the course and be ready to make corrections along the way, because even though the real version won't have Klingons or Borg or Cardassians, it's still going to be a long and bumpy ride. But if along the way it transports us to a kinder, smarter, more inclusive, more just, and more peaceful world, it'll be a ride worth taking. Now, as for me and the question at the center of all of this, some of you might be curious which era of Star Trek I would actually want to live in. Personally, I think there's only one choice. Late 23rd century, the classic Trek movie era. Life on Earth is good, the Federation is strong and stable, the era is relatively free of major conflicts and catastrophes, there's lots of space left to explore, and still many noble battles to fight, and most importantly, you can't beat the fashion. This is the future we deserve. Hey folks, hope you enjoyed this one. I'm going to let you know what the subject of the next Trek Actually video is going to be, but before I do that, I want to give shoutouts to some of my newest Patreon patrons and channel members. First, the new patrons. They are Adam Winkleman. Thanks, Adam. Frenchie's Fiber Files. Thanks, Frenchie's Fiber Files. Ronan of Stag. Thanks, Ronan of Stag. Doga Kirkuaglu. Thanks, Doga. Peter Ravenscroft, thanks Peter. Happy TPR, thanks Happy TPR. Steve Coleman, thanks Steve. KTB, thanks KT. William Kalsher, thanks William. Ed Mark Starr, thanks Ed. Phoenix Knight, thanks Phoenix. Farah Grimm, thanks Farah Grimm. Jessica O. Bell, thanks Jessica. Bonnie Baran, thanks Bonnie. And now for the new channel members. They are Winston Walrus, thanks Winston. Gary Curtis, thanks Gary. Stephen Brandt, thanks Stephen. Russell Kopp, thanks Russell. Manic Anti-Fascist, thanks Manic Anti-Fascist. Haley Ryan, thanks Haley. Robert Willows 118, thanks Robert. Ms. Catriana, thanks Ms. Catriana. Liberty, thanks, Liberty. Lori Gomez Real Estate. Thanks, Lori Gomez Real Estate. If you want to support this channel, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Steve Shives or clicking the join button to become a member of this channel. All patrons and members get access to exclusive posts that allow you to vote in the polls that determine upcoming Trek Actually topics, and also submit questions ahead of time for my twice monthly Ask Away live streams. If you pledge $5 a month or more on Patreon or become a member at the $5 a month tier or higher, you get a shout out at the end of a Trek Actually video. If you'd rather give a one-time gift, than a recurring monthly contribution, you're always more than welcome to do that by clicking the thanks button right below the video or via PayPal or Venmo. The links for those are in the video description. Many thanks. If you like what I do on YouTube, especially the Star Trek related stuff, you should also check out my side projects, The Ensign's Log, the Star Trek themed comedy podcast that I'm on alongside Jason Harding and Dana Cole, and Trek Reluctantly, the watch-along stream Dana and I do every Wednesday starting at 6 p.m. Eastern on this channel right here. As always, links in the description. Now, for next month's Regulation Trek Actually topic, and oh, what a wonderful thing it was to check the results of the patrons and members poll and discover that my supporters, or a majority of them that voted in this poll anyway, are true romantics at heart, because next month is February and the winning topic in the poll was the one most appropriate for the month of Valentine's Day, the celebration of love. Star Trek over the years has had no shortage of romance, and next time around we're going to take a look at some of the more notable Trek romances as we search for an answer to the question, what is actually Star Trek's greatest love story? That's next month. I'll be back then and a bunch of times before then, so until the next time you see me, whenever that is, thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.